You have always been a burden. My daughter's words, an invisible blade, pierce straight through my heart. When love becomes something disposable, and every act of sacrifice only makes me feel like a burden. Is there anyone who truly listens to the voice of my heart? This is not just the story of a father abandoned in silence, but a journey to find myself again. This is a story of pain, betrayal, and a cruel truth. Sometimes letting go is the only way to save yourself. Early in the morning, when the first rays of the day only gently slipped through the curtains faded by time, the father woke up. He needed no alarm clock, no one to urge him on. Each morning, when the dawn breeze blew through the window, he awoke, steady and unconscious of it. Habit had sunk deep into his mind, like part of life's rhythm. The small house was as quiet as on any other morning. No sound rose except the soft creak of the door as he opened it, the hush of footsteps brushing along the empty hallway, and his own sigh. His house was like a sealed box, shutting in every feeling and memory. The air inside was still fresh, yet it lacked the warmth of love. The paintings on the walls had faded with the years. The objects in the house, once cherished keepsakes, were now no more than soulless decorations. No one stopped to look at them. No one remembered them. In the dim morning light, he stood before the window, looking out at the flower garden he had poured so much effort into tending. The garden was not large, but to him it was a world of its own. The pots of periwinkle, though small, gave off a gentle, simple beauty. Pale pink petals and lush green leaves swayed in the light breeze, the gift he gave himself after each long, lonely day. He remembered every round of watering, every breeze that brought the flowers into bloom. Whenever he sat down to watch the blossoms open, he felt a certain connection, a life streaming into the space, tiny yet warm. But as with the years that had passed, no one noticed this garden. His daughter no longer paused there, no longer asked him how to care for the plants or praised the periwinkles. She only hurried past, eyes straight ahead, never once stopping to look at him, at the pots he had tended with all his affection. He did not feel sad because she said nothing about the pots, nor wounded by her indifference, yet within him a sense of emptiness slowly kindled. The feeling of being forgotten came not only from the fact that no one noticed the pots, but also from the fact that no one acknowledged his presence in this house. He looked at those fresh blossoms and wondered whether his daughter still remembered the old days, when every morning she would run out into the yard, sit beside him, and watch the newly opened flowers. Those moments had now become blurred memories, memories that neither of them remembered anymore. After watering the flower pots, the father went back inside, where breakfast had yet to be prepared. He walked slowly into the kitchen, where everything was still just as it had been in earlier days, but without the liveliness of family mornings. On the kitchen table sat his daughter's favorite teacup, the porcelain cup he had bought her on a trip to a faraway place many years ago. He had carefully polished that cup every day since she was little. Each time his daughter sat down, he would bring it out, fill it with tea, and set it before her. Simple conversations over that. Teacup, peaceful mornings in which family affection was expressed through gentle gestures that seemed small, yet were profoundly important to him. But now that porcelain cup was only a memory. His daughter no longer used it. She no longer paid it any mind, not even once sitting down to drink tea with him. She only hurriedly grabbed a disposable paper cup, gliding past him like a ghost, with no greeting, no inquiry after him. The father held the cup in his hands. Its chill tightened his heart. He did not blame her, nor feel sorrow because she no longer used it. He felt only one thing: silence, a pause stretching on in the kitchen, in the space around him. Each day he held that cup and polished it carefully, as if he could restore a piece of the past. But no, what he was doing were meaningless acts that no one noticed, and in this way he became an extra in his own home. She came into the kitchen without looking at him. She hurriedly took the paper cup and lifted her head to say, "Dad, I'm going now." A brief sentence without warmth, without anything that could be called affection. The father looked at her, standing quietly, a mere silhouette in the kitchen, like part of a painting. yet not belonging to it. His daughter, though right before him, still did not see him. She did not sense his presence, did not know how long he had stood there, only to polish the cup, only to wait for a little concern. The feeling of being forgotten, of being abandoned in his own home, pained him. He did not need much attention, just a glance, a word of concern, but there was nothing. He sat down at the dining table, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold. No one sat with him anymore. Meals had become solitary moments. He looked out the window at the garden he tended, but felt no joy, no peace in his heart. The memories of a happy family were now only a faint trace in his mind. Meals no longer held laughter, no longer brought shared stories. Only silence remained, heavy and impossible to dispel. He felt the change, the distance between himself and the family widening by the day. The daughter he had spent so many years loving no longer recognized him. He could not explain what had happened, but he knew one thing clearly. He was no longer a part of her life. And that hurt more than any words, for he had sacrificed so much to be with her, to care for her. But now he had become a ghost in the house to which he had given all his love. Each day he went on doing those small things, yet received no acknowledgement. The loving acts he did for the family no longer held any value. The love he devoted to them now seemed meaningless. All he had left was silence and the ever-growing emptiness in his heart. Each morning, when the first rays of the day gently spill through the window, the father wakes in the stillness of the empty house. The house is not very large, but every step he takes in it echoes with soft, unfamiliar sounds, as if he were walking through old memories, traces that cannot be erased. He wakes not because of an alarm clock, but out of habit. Every morning, he wakes at the same fixed hour, as if making an effort to begin the new day with a little hope, even though he knows that hope may flicker out in the hours that follow. He is in no hurry. Everything in the house is so familiar that he does not need to think much, but precisely in those quiet moments, he feels a silent pain rising in his heart. Quietly walking down the hallway, he stops at the kitchen window where the light begins to shine in, casting faint little streaks across the tabletop. In the darkness of the kitchen, where the family's breakfasts used to brim with joy, now there are only hurried footsteps and wordless sounds of cooking. His daughter has been up since early, but she no longer takes time to look around, to notice him as before. He stands there in that small, narrow space, watching her movements, the familiar motions as she prepares breakfast. But in his heart, there is a nameless worry. Is she hurrying because she does not want to be near him, or is she only gliding past him because of the cares of life? The father is all too familiar with this scene. He looks at his daughter and sees her cooking breakfast while absorbed in her phone, her eyes sunk into the screen as if she were living in another world, a world where he no longer has a place. On mornings before, when she was little and the family still gathered together, he remembers sitting with his daughter, eating breakfast together, talking about small things in life, the day's little joys. But now all of that has become the past. He looks at his daughter and knows she no longer remembers those moments. She does not need him anymore. And the son-in-law, who used to be an important part of his life, has now also become a fading silhouette. In earlier times, when the family gathered, the son-in-law was always friendly, always calling him Dad with a tender look. But now, when he steps into the living room, the son-in-law only glances at him and then resumes his work. No greeting, no affectionate gesture. At times, as he stands in the living room, he feels like an excess piece, an unnecessary part. Never before had he felt that way, when the family was still close-knit and loving. But now, their coldness makes him feel like a stranger, an invisible guest in the very home he helped build. With each unreturned glance, each time his daughter hurries out of the house, without managing to look at him, the father feels ever more as if he has been pushed outside the family's life. He does not blame her, does not resent his son-in-law, but loneliness is eating away at him day by day. He recalls earlier days when they were still a reunited family, when mornings were the time the whole household sat together, shared a meal, and told stories about the day before. Those memories have now become blurred images in his mind, images he cannot reach. The father's longing for love becomes clearer with every moment of the morning. Each morning, he stands beside the stove, quietly observing his daughter, hoping there will be some moment, an exchanged look or a gentle gesture from her. But no, she is still in a rush, still gliding past him as if he did not exist. He feels like a ghost in his own house, an excess part in his daughter's life. With every morning that passes, he asks himself what he can do to change this situation. He does not want to become a burden. He does not want to bother them, but deep inside, he only wants to be loved, only wants a place in his daughter's heart where he can still find care and warmth. One day, while sitting alone in the living room, the father happened to notice an old family photograph taken on a trip to the Grand Canyon, where the family had a wonderful holiday full of laughter and joy. He picked up the photo and looked at the smiling faces of his daughter and son-in-law, recalling the happy moments when the whole family explored new things together, the simple joys of life. In that photograph, his daughter was still a little girl with bright eyes, shining with innocence and faith in life. He remembered then when everyone held hands and chatted cheerfully, but now he is no longer part of that world. The distance between that memory and the cold present feels like a bottomless chasm, impossible to fill. He feels pain when he looks at that photograph because he knows everything has changed. His daughter no longer needs him, no longer needs his presence in her life. The sweet memories are now only hazy images, untouchable. With each passing day, he feels that distance growing ever deeper. He does not know what he can do to change this situation. He does not know whether his daughter will ever turn back and recognize the love he has for her. But he still keeps standing there, quietly observing, still hoping that one day she will look at him, will see him. Those tiny moments become the only source of encouragement in his heart, though he knows they may never come. The pain is not the absence of his daughter from his life, but her silence and coldness, the feeling that he has become a superfluous person in his own home. He does not ask for much, just a moment of affection, a gesture of concern, a gentle look. But all of that has grown distant, like a dream he can never touch. Their house, a typical suburban home, sat quietly among wide, expansive streets and rows of identical houses. Yet to the father, this house was no longer the warm nest it once was. It had become more like a common space where those inside no longer felt connected, no longer sensed love or care. Whenever he sat in the old armchair in the living room and looked out the window, he could clearly see the stark divide between himself and his family. The house kept its outward form, but its inner content, its liveliness, seemed to have gradually faded. Early in the morning, as sunlight began to stream through the misty windows, the father woke as he did every day, but today he no longer felt any eagerness about starting a new day. The days gone by felt like a chain of repetitive, unchanging tasks. He no longer remembered clearly what he had done in the moments before waking. He only knew that every morning was the same. He would wake up, step steadily into the kitchen to brew a cup of tea, then tend to the little garden he cared for day after day. That garden, though full of pots of periwinkles and ornamental plants he always tended carefully, had become a quiet place that no one cared about. Each morning, he still went out to water the plants, but no one stood watching him. No one asked about the drops of water he diligently poured onto each leaf. The flowers still bloomed, but no one saw them. They were only small petals, gradually fading under the harsh sun, with no one looking closely at them. His hands had grown sturdier, more worn through years of hard work. Dry, calloused fingers kept performing simple actions that no one understood. He meticulously cleaned the garden, trimmed each branch, clipped the leaves so everything would look neat and tidy. But all those efforts, all the work he did every day, seemed never to mean anything to his daughter and son-in-law. They no longer saw him. They paid no attention to what he was doing. His small gestures no longer had value in their eyes. Everything had become meaningless. Each day he still did everything around the house, from carrying home groceries to wiping down the kitchen and washing the dishes, but no one cared. His daughter never asked whether he needed anything, whether he was tired, whether he felt lonely. She only rushed past, hurrying to work, paying no mind to her father's quiet steps. And the son-in-law was the same. He had never received a tender look, a sincere inquiry from his son-in-law. They regarded him only as a silent helper in the house, an indispensable piece to get things done. But no one truly cared about him as a person. At times, the father wondered whether he was living in his own house at all. A house that had once held feelings, beautiful moments, cozy conversations, but now everything had changed. He lived in a house, a space where he had become an extra. Each morning he woke, tended the garden, worried over small details in the home, but no one noticed. Only when something needed fixing, when a faucet broke or a light burned out, was he called to work. And when the job was done, he returned to that space of forgetfulness. He did not blame his daughter and son-in-law. They were not bad people, but they were too busy with their own lives. They no longer had time to look at him, to recognize his presence. Their repetitive tasks, their phones, their messages, their work calls made them forget that he was still there, still quietly living with them, like a nameless, faceless ghost, unseen. The family nest he had built was now only cold walls, a space that no longer contained love. One day, as he stood by the windowsill, watching his daughter bustle about her work, he felt a deep loneliness. It was not loneliness for lack of company, but the loneliness of absence in his own home. The simple acts of love he had once given his family had become meaningless. The meals he had prepared since early morning were no longer occasions for the family to gather. Conversations no longer unfolded over meals. There were no more questions about today or plans for tomorrow. The silences in the house were nothing but passing drafts of wind, no one pausing to listen, to feel. When he stepped into the kitchen and saw his daughter grab her bag for work without managing a greeting, another crack opened in his heart. He stood there, saying nothing, only watching her back as she left. The feeling swelled within him, a feeling he could share with no one, the feeling of being abandoned in his own home. She had grown up, had her own life, and he was only a spare part in it. Each time he helped her, each time he fixed something in the house, he had to face the truth that he was only a superfluous person now, no longer present in her life. Sometimes he asked himself whether he was living in a family or merely a stranger in his own home. He was not a stranger, yet the feeling of being forgotten was stronger than ever. He did not need gifts, did not need words of thanks. He only needed to be seen, to be noticed, to know that he still existed in the lives of those he had spent his whole life loving. But no, they did not see him. They did not recognize his presence. The tasks he performed each day were only quiet actions that went unreceived. He lived in a small, isolated world, inside a large house bustling with tasks, calls, messages, and relationships out there, one in which he no longer had any part. One morning, like any other, the father woke before sunrise, a habit that never changed. The house was still in silence. Last night's stains still clung to the wall. The unwashed bowls lay waiting in the sink. He got out of bed and breathed in the early morning air of the quiet room. In the dark, he could feel the cold closing in around him. No one else was awake at this hour. The house was still asleep, and he, like an invisible ghost, quietly began the new day. He needed no alarm, no urging from anyone. He simply woke because the habit had been etched into his mind over so many years. He stepped into the kitchen on light feet and prepared the ingredients for the blueberry pancakes his daughter loved. When she was little, whenever he made them, she would always run into the kitchen, eyes lighting up, and shout with delight, "Dad's making pancakes." Back then, the kitchen was always full of laughter and excitement. The whole family ate breakfast together, shared cheerful stories, and life was simple but brimming with happiness. Now all those moments were only hazy memories, memories the father still could not forget. He took the batter, poured it into the pan, gently flipped the pancakes, then added a few fresh blueberries on top, watching them slowly turn golden plump blueberries like little gems, setting a brilliant color against the pancakes. The sweet aroma spread through the air, yet no one paid attention. He set the pancakes on a plate, tending to each one as if creating a work of art, not only to eat, but also to send along his love. He hoped that when his daughter came downstairs and saw the dish, she would feel the love he had for her, the care he still quietly expressed through small actions. When the daughter finally stepped into the kitchen, sunlight streamed through the window, softening the kitchen's worn edges. She did not stop, did not look at him, but went straight to the dining table. Her eyes stayed glued to the phone screen, as if she were immersed in a separate world, one in which the father seemed to have no place. He looked at her for a moment, saw her hurrying, not bothering to notice the pancakes he had carefully prepared. She sat down at the table, eyes still fixed on the phone, fingers swiftly skimming through notifications and messages. Long seconds of silence stretched on. No one said a word. "Anything good today, Dad?" his daughter asked, her tone indifferent without a trace of concern. The question rang in the air, but there was no expectation in it. She did not look at him, did not pause to hear the answer. Then, just a moment later, she let drop. "I'm late, I have to go." She stood up, grabbed her bag, and hurried out of the kitchen without another word. The pancakes he had made lay still on the table, untouched, tasted by no one. Only the father remained, sitting in silence, his heart as if clenched tight. He held the teacup in his hand, but no longer had the strength to drink. The pancakes he had made since early morning were now just forgotten food. His daughter did not see the sacrifice in each of his actions, did not recognize the love in the simple dishes he prepared. All he had left was emptiness, the feeling he had become invisible. He was present in this house, present in his daughter's life, and yet no one saw him. That feeling was not merely loneliness. It ran much deeper. He felt as if he were a ghost, absent from her mind. He had done everything to maintain the family's bond, but all those efforts seemed meaningless. Each morning he still woke, still made breakfast, still tended the garden, but those actions were no longer valued. He did these things out of love, because he wanted to see his family happy. But now what he did had become unnoticed habits that no one acknowledged. The questions he asked his daughter, the morning greetings, none of them were answered anymore. She did not see him, no longer heard his reminders, no longer sensed his presence in her life. He had become part of the space, but not a part of her life. He could feel the world moving around him, yet he could not find a place in it. He did not ask for much, just a little concern, a glance, a small inquiry, but all of it had become meaningless. He had sacrificed too much for this family, yet received no appreciation, no love he thought he deserved. The pancakes he had taken the time to make were not only food, they were part of his fragile hopes. Hopes that his daughter would recognize his care, hopes that one day she would turn and see him as a part of her life. But now he realized those hopes were too far away. Each time she passed by without looking at him, each time she did not answer his question, his heart throbbed with pain. He was no longer part of her life, but only a ghost, a blurred image in her mind. His sacrifices had become something taken for granted, something not to be spoken of, not to be acknowledged. He remained in this house, without thanks, without attention, and in the empty kitchen he sat there, looking at the untouched pancakes, and realized that the love he gave his daughter had now become something invisible, an invisible affection that no one recognized, no one valued. He was physically present, but emotionally he had become an indispensable yet unseen part, like the pancakes he made, created with so much love, yet left forgotten. Their house was always full of sounds, laughter, conversation, footsteps, but those sounds had now faded into faint traces in the air, not because the family lacked life, but because that life no longer held any real connection among the members. The people living in this house, though close in physical proximity, were drifting farther and farther apart. The silent, unspoken tensions grew more evident, not displayed in fierce quarrels or big arguments, but seeping into every corner of the house, into every glance, every step, every silence between words. Each day, the father woke at dawn when the house was still sunk in darkness and quiet. He did everything in the house quietly, gently, as if afraid that noise would shatter the artificial peace surrounding them. He didn't need an alarm clock. Habit had taught him to rise at that hour for many years. In the first days, when he began to sense the change, he thought everything was just small matters, passing tensions. But day by day, the silence grew heavier, like an invisible wall enclosing him. Every morning, he tried to begin the day with familiar tasks. He stepped into the kitchen, started brewing a cup of tea, then set about preparing breakfast for the family. One of the dishes he often made was blueberry pancakes, the food his daughter had loved as a child. He remembered how, when she was little, each morning he made pancakes, she would run into the kitchen, sit at the table, and eat with such delight. Back then, family breakfasts were always a time for everyone to share stories, where he felt love and connection. But now, when he prepared pancakes for her, he only hoped that at least she would sit and eat a little, or at least feel his care through this meal. Yet those hopes seemed like distant dreams. When his daughter stepped into the kitchen, the light from the window shone in, highlighting the appealing pancakes on the table, but she merely drifted past them like a shadow. She did not meet his eyes, did not recognize his care. She simply sat quietly at the table, phone in hand, her gaze never leaving the screen. She did not look at the pancakes he had made with all his heart. Not a word of thanks, not a single inquiry. "Anything good today, Dad?" Her question sounded like a social nicety, but there was no concern in her tone. After speaking, she went back to her phone without waiting for a reply. "I'm late. I have to go," she said, hurrying away from the table, leaving him alone with a plate of untouched pancakes. The sight was a shock to the father. He watched his daughter's back as she left, a stab of pain in his heart. It was not anger or disappointment, but emptiness, a deep void in his soul. He wasn't merely lonely. He felt completely invisible. Even though he was there, even though he sat across from his daughter, emotionally he was like a stranger. His efforts, his sacrifices seemed no longer valued. She did not realize he had risen early, had made pancakes, simply because he wanted her to have breakfast with him, to share a small moment in the day. The truth was, she did not see him. She did not recognize what he had done for her, did not feel the love he tried to convey through those simple acts. The father felt like a ghost, existing in this house without anyone noticing. He was no longer part of his daughter's life. With each passing day, he felt himself becoming more and more invisible in her eyes. His love was no longer cherished, his presence no longer acknowledged. He had not only become unimportant, he had become something taken for granted, as if he were merely someone present in the house, but not truly part of the family. He was no longer loved in the way he had hoped. The daughter did not look at him. She did not talk to him. She no longer shared her life with him. And that silence made the father feel like a piece of the past, no longer present in her present. This hurt more than any criticism, not because she did not love him, but because she no longer needed him. He had done everything he could to knit this family back together, but now he realized he was only a shadow, an indispensable part of the house, yet no longer a part of his daughter's life. Nor did it stop there. The silence did not come only from his daughter. His son-in-law, the one he had once thought would be helpful, someone who would step in when needed, no longer regarded him as part of the family either. Once, when he needed his son-in-law to fix a leaking faucet, the man showed not the slightest concern. He worked with obvious reluctance, gave the father an indifferent look, then returned to his own tasks. It wasn't that he couldn't help. It was that he didn't want to. His gaze was full of displeasure, as if he were doing something that wasn't his responsibility. Each time it happened, the father felt himself becoming a burden, not only financially, but emotionally. Whenever his son-in-law looked at the grocery bill and skimmed over the numbers with a frown, the father felt like a financial load on the family. The expenses he had to cover, even the small ones, now seemed to be a big issue for them. They didn't say it outright, but he could feel the resentment in the air, the whispers about money, the talk about what they needed to do to reduce the burden of him. Each was like a knife driven into his heart. He could not deny that he had become the family's unspoken burden, and this tension was ever clearer in every conversation, in every exchange glance between daughter and son-in-law. Though no one said it aloud, this tension, this invisibility, was more painful than any quarrel. It made the father feel left behind, no longer part of family life. He was not just superfluous in their lives, he was someone who no longer had value. No one told him he was a burden. No one said it, but he could feel it in their every breath. With each day, he felt more helpless. On the mornings when he made pancakes, on the evenings when he sat alone, that feeling became clearer than ever. He wasn't merely lonely. He felt like a ghost existing in this house without anyone seeing him. His sacrifices had become things taken for granted, things no one valued anymore. And in all of that, he realized that he was no longer a part of the family. Each day, the father more clearly felt the change in how his daughter and son-in-law treated him. The changes were not loud or obvious, but small details, gradual shifts that seemed harmless, yet were deeply painful. Every time he tried to approach them, to feel some warmth, he realized there was an invisible distance between them and him, growing wider and denser. Actions that had once been familiar now turned into moments of displacement, making him feel he was no longer part of the family. Each morning, when he tried to get close to his daughter, when he tried to talk to her, he felt the coldness in her every movement. In the past, mornings spent eating together were times for the family to share stories and feelings. Now, whenever she stepped into the kitchen, her eyes no longer lingered on him. She no longer looked him in the eye, no longer asked after him sincerely. Instead, her gaze always drifted elsewhere, to her own concerns, to the things she felt took priority in life. She simply walked past him, not recognizing his presence. One day, while he was standing in the living room, she walked by without turning back. That feeling was so painful. Before, whenever they passed each other, she would always pause for a moment, pat his shoulder, smile, and ask, "Dad, how are you?" But now those pats had become perfunctory, quick and devoid of feeling. That touch, though such a small gesture, now carried a chill, a distance that made the father feel he was gradually disappearing. It was like a painful reminder that she no longer cared about him. The father was not someone who easily showed his emotions. He had always kept everything to himself. Yet this change was a great shock to him. Each time she patted his shoulder, not as before, but with a quick, brisk, tenderness-less pat, he felt like an outsider. Once, when he tried to approach her and ask about something in her day, she gave a cursory answer and quickly went back to her work. Her eyes no longer looked at him. They were always turned somewhere else, as if she were avoiding him. That feeling kept growing in his heart, a feeling that he was being pushed out of his own life. As for the son-in-law, whom he had once regarded as his own son, he no longer cared about him either. Whenever the father entered a room, the son-in-law would turn his back and not bother to look. It wasn't open hostility, but an invisible avoidance that made the father feel like an obstacle in the space. Whenever he entered, the son-in-law never looked at him, never greeted him. Everything was conveyed by the son-in-law's eyes and unconscious actions, glances that slid past, turning away when the father stepped into the room. The son-in-law had never said anything outright, but his actions said it all. The father felt he was no longer part of the family. This feeling was not just loneliness. It was not a lack in the material sense, but an emotional deprivation, a sense that he was no longer important in the lives of those he loved. He wondered whether his daughter still loved him, whether she still remembered the old days when she was little, when he took care of her, raised her, and loved her unconditionally. whether she still remembered the times he took her to school, the times he sat by her side when she was sad, the times he poured all his affection into caring for her, and the son-in-law, whom he had helped so many times. Did he still consider the father part of the family, or was the father merely an unnecessary person to be avoided, someone who no longer had a place in their lives? This question circled through the father's mind every day. He could not answer it for himself, could not explain the sadness growing in his heart. Though he kept silent in these days, he felt like a loved one who, by definition, ought to be cherished, only to be met with cold indifference. Each of their actions, each avoidance, each turn back, each failure to look at him, was like an invisible sentence, a reminder of how meaningless his presence seemed in this family's life. He was no longer someone to be loved. He was something to be dealt with, an indispensable piece yet unwelcome. The father began to feel like a problem. He no longer felt love from those dearest to him. His presence only heightened the tension like an unwanted factor in the house. He was not a friend, not a close companion they wished to share with, but someone to be managed. As the days went by, he felt more and more distant from his daughter and son-in-law, and in those moments, he asked himself whether he still had a place in their lives, whether they still loved him as before, or whether he was merely an object in their house. All of this weighed ever heavier on the father's heart. He could not understand why everything had changed so much, why the sincere feelings he had for his daughter and son-in-law were not returned, why his presence was no longer recognized or appreciated. Was he still an important person in this family, or only invisible, an essential part of life, yet unloved? This feeling, this cold indifference became unbearable. He could not speak of it, for he knew no one would understand. But in his heart, the pain kept growing, making him feel he had no value, no longer an important part of this family. His efforts had become futile, as if he had turned into a burden in the very house he had built a ghost no longer noticed, no longer loved. The news that his daughter had won a $30 million lottery came like an unexpected wave. On an ordinary morning, as the first light was just beginning to slip through the window frame, the father sat quietly in his kitchen, a cup of tea in hand. The whole house was still asleep except for him, the one who woke before the sun could climb high, a habit etched deep into his mind over many years. This house, with its old walls and worn chairs, was no longer a place filled with joy. Instead, it had become a place that held stretches of silence, distant glances, and a heavy atmosphere the father could not dispel. Everything changed on a Sunday morning when his daughter received an unexpected call, the news that sent the whole family into an indescribable burst of joy. She had won a $30 million lottery, an enormous sum. Congratulations rang out. Happiness spread through the house. His daughter could not hide her delight at knowing her life would change forever, that financial hardship would no longer be a problem, that she would now have everything she wanted. They had dreamed of such a life for years, dreamed of a day when they could live without thinking about money. As soon as she heard the news, his daughter began calling everyone, announcing her wonderful prize. She beamed as she talked about her plans for the future, the things she would buy, the trips she would take, and a new house. While she was on the phone, the father stood quietly in the corner of the kitchen, cup in hand, eyes following his daughter, yet unable to join the celebration. He wanted to smile with her, to share the joy, but he felt he no longer had a place in her life. Her joy had no room for him. She was living in another world, a world with no place for him, the father she had once loved. As things grew livelier, he decided to join in, trying to smile, trying to blend into the jubilant atmosphere. But only a moment later he realized he was no longer part of it. His daughter, though overjoyed, did not let her gaze rest on him for long. Her smiles were not for him, but for her husband, for others, for the new plans she had drawn up. Everyone around him was elated, but he felt like a foreign object in his own home. Their joy was not meant for him, not shared with him. He felt it, even though no one said a word. The father's sense of being pushed aside became even clearer as he stood quietly in the kitchen, watching them celebrate. Each laugh, each clap, each congratulatory hug was no longer a shared happiness, but a clear division between him and them. In those moments, he could not help feeling like an outsider. These should have been family moments, yet there was no place for him in them. His efforts, the sacrifices he had made all his life to raise the family, had now become unnecessary, as if he had lost his value in their lives. While the celebration was going on, his daughter received another call, and he happened to overhear the conversation. She spoke softly into the phone, but he could still catch every word. At last we can start over, a new life without any burdens. Though she didn't speak directly about him, he knew exactly what she meant. His heart shattered instantly. He had sacrificed so many years so this family could be happy, had tried his utmost to raise her, to help her, yet now he was just a burden in her eyes. Those words were like a blade driven straight into his heart. He felt like something unnecessary, no longer loved. She did not say she hated him. She did not say he was a burden. But that single sentence made him see everything. What he had done, what he had sacrificed, had become something that needed to be started over, something to be removed. She didn't say it outright, but those words, careless as they were the most painful he had ever heard. The family's new wealth was not a shared joy, but an invisible weapon turned against him. This change brought him no happiness. It only made his isolation in his own home more stark. Now, with a large sum in hand, his daughter felt she could begin again, live a new life without burdens. And the father, the person she had once loved most, was pushed out of those plans and projects. What he had done for her had become an obstacle, something without value. Their relationship was no longer built on love, but on calculations and material shifts. As the family continued to celebrate, the father stood quietly in the corner of the room, looking at their joy, yet unable to join it. He felt like a lifeless painting in a house of which he was no longer a part. One would think winning the lottery would bring the family happiness, but for him it only highlighted the distance, the coldness, and his worthlessness in this life. He knew money couldn't change everything, but it had changed everything for him. Now he was no longer someone to be loved, no longer someone with whom they wanted to share their lives. He was only a burden, an unavoidable obstacle they did not want to face. All his efforts, all his sacrifices were now only part of a past that could not return. And in that painful moment, he realized one thing: he was no longer part of this family. He had lost not only love, but also his importance in their lives. As the family's celebration began to subside, the air in the house returned to calm. But for the father, it was a taut, anxious stillness. After the laughter and congratulations had faded, his daughter, eyes alight with excitement and joy, came to him again. This time, not with the love and gratitude of bygone days, but with a cold, emotionless detachment he could never have imagined. As she approached, the father looked into her face and clearly saw the change in her, yet he still could not accept it. His daughter, though grown, had always been his pride. He had always felt he held an important place in her life, but now, as she stood before him, her eyes were no longer those of a loving daughter. They were the eyes of a stranger, without a trace of feeling. She could still call him Dad, but the way the word left her lips felt like nothing more than an ordinary utterance, stripped of any bond or tenderness. "Dad," she began, but her voice had none of the warmth he once knew. It was cold and indifferent. "We have enough money now. We don't need you here anymore. We're about to buy a bigger house, and there won't be a place for you." Those words struck like a mortal blow to the father's heart. Each syllable fell like a cold stone, choking his breath, making him unable to believe what he had just heard. They were not spoken by a stranger, but by his own daughter, the one to whom he had devoted all his love for his entire life. He had sacrificed so much, worked tirelessly, done everything so she could have a good life. Those sacrifices, the sleepless nights of work, the savings taken to help her when she needed it, were now repaid with a cold sentence that rejected his very presence in this family. He stood there, stunned, unable to speak, everything around him seemed to spin, no longer a home, no longer a place of love and connection. His daughter, the one he had spent his life caring for, loving and protecting, now spoke in an indifferent tone, seeing him as an excess, a burden they did not want to carry. It felt as though he was no longer the father she needed. He was being excluded, not only physically, but emotionally, no longer an important part of her life. The father tried to swallow his tears, but they spilled over, uncontrollable. What had he done wrong? Why did all he had done for this family no longer matter? He had given his entire life to her, worrying over every meal, every sleep from her childhood to adulthood, sacrificing personal keepsakes and his own dreams just so she could attend university and have a bright future. And now, all of that meant nothing. She no longer needed him. She no longer saw him as part of the family's life. The keepsakes he had sold to help cover her tuition years ago had suddenly become items without value in her eyes. Sweet family memories, mornings gathered together, were now erased by a new life she imagined would be lighter, more comfortable without him in it. The new fortune, $30 million, was not merely money. It was an invisible weapon turned against him. It freed her from the burdens she believed were holding her back, and the father was one of those burdens. The pain of being cast out was devastating, but what hurt the father most was not that she drove him from the house. It was her ingratitude. It was the extreme coldness, without the slightest pity or regret. The years he had poured out his love and sacrifice were now treated as something obvious and expected, as though he were only a tool to serve her life, with no right to ask for anything in return. He could not accept this truth. He could not understand how his daughter could be so cold, when, as a child, she had always run to him when she was sad, always sought him to share her feelings. But now she not only shunned him, she spoke such cutting words. He wondered whether he had become invisible in this family, whether the love he had given her was now only part of a past that could never return, whether he had been too blind in believing that family love could not change. The father could not utter a single word. He simply stood there, his heart in agony, his eyes blurred with tears. He could say nothing, only stand silently as she voiced things he had never imagined. He had loved his daughter with all his heart, and this was how she answered him, not with thanks or concern, but with rejection, cold and unfeeling. With every word she spoke, the father felt the world he had built all his life shatter. He was no longer the father she needed, but an object with no place in her life. Those words were not merely an expulsion from the house. They were an emotional dismissal. It was ingratitude, an unbearable coldness, not from a stranger, but from his own daughter, the one he had given everything to. He could not escape the thought that he had spent too much time and effort nurturing love, only to be met with indifference. That feeling, when the love you give becomes meaningless, when your sacrifices go unappreciated, is a pain beyond words. His love, in his daughter's eyes, had become a burden. That morning, after the father quietly packed his belongings, he said not a word to his daughter. Everything was done. There was nothing left to say. The cups, the teacups, the old clothes he had once loved, all were neatly wrapped up. Those things were no longer family keepsakes, no longer marks of years of love gone by. Each item seemed only to make him remember the old days, the moments when he was still loved, still part of this family. But now all that remained was a vast emptiness in his heart. The feeling of loneliness, of worthlessness, was not something that came from outside, but an understanding, a realization that he had been shut out of his children's lives long ago. He stepped out of the house, a chill enveloping him. His steps were no longer hurried. They had gone through this life like a long road, yet it seemed he was walking it alone. Nothing around him had changed. The familiar streets, the houses he had once tended, the little garden where he had spent so many mornings, everything was still there. But now they had become distant memories, as if he were passing through someone else's world. These streets, where he had once lived with his family, were now only a strange place where he was no longer a part. With every step along those familiar streets, he felt like a stranger. Turning a corner, the father saw a family strolling together, laughing and chatting happily. They joked with one another, traded hugs and words of congratulations. The sight pained him. Looking at them, he realized clearly that that kind of family was no longer his. He was no longer the person his daughter wanted to share happy moments with, no longer the one they wanted to tell their life stories to. The father tried to push those thoughts aside, but he could not escape the deep emptiness in his heart. At last he came to a small eatery on the corner, a place where he had once sat to drink coffee on quiet mornings before the family was split as it was now. A simple place with a few small tables set close together, yet it was where he felt at peace, where he could sit alone and think about life. He went in and sat at a table near the window where the morning light gently fell, casting hazy streaks across the tabletop. The feeling was strange. He felt calm, yet also lost, alone in this world, as if he had given everything up, and now all that remained was a bare existence no one recognized. The father sat there with a cup of coffee in his hand, but did not drink. He looked out the window at the passers-by, the cars hurrying along, the people living their lives without noticing his presence. For the first time, he did not think about his daughter. His heart no longer beat in the rhythm of love for her, no longer sought recognition or affection from her. For the first time in many years, he did not try to find a way to please anyone. He thought about himself, about his own life. He asked whether he still knew who he was, whether he could still feel the simple things he had once loved. How could he find again the person he had lost over so many years? In the quiet of the eatery, he began to remember himself. He remembered being a young man, still passionate, still full of zest for life. He remembered the dreams, the longings, the ambitions that had now been pushed aside. He had once been strong, brimming with life, always believing that love and sacrifice could bring change. But when the family became everything, he lost his way in caring for them, in worrying for them, to the point of forgetting who he was, forgoing the things he had once loved. He had lived for others for too long, and now, when everything had collapsed, he realized he was no longer living for himself. He sat there in the hush of the eatery with an indescribable pain. Yet at the same time, a quiet strength rose within him, a feeling he had never had before, a sense of self-awareness, a recognition of himself he had never allowed before. He realized he was not useless, not a burden. He was not someone who existed only to serve others. He was a human being with his own value, with dignity, with the right to love and respect himself. He did not need anyone's acknowledgement, did not need his daughter's love or anyone else's to know that he had worth. For the first time in many years, he felt light, a lightness not from solving the family's problems, but from freeing himself from the pressures he had imposed on himself. The sacrifices, the efforts, the memories gone by were not meaningless. They had not disappeared, but they could no longer be allowed to become a burden to him. He could not change the past, but he could change how he looked at it and how he saw himself in the future. The father stood up, feeling he had found again a part of himself he had once forgotten. He was no longer the shadow in the family, no longer someone who lived only to please others. He had the right to live for himself. He had the right to love himself, not for anyone else's sake, but for his own. He stepped out of the eatery, no longer tired or in pain. His steps were now steady, full of strength, and he knew that whatever lay ahead, he would no longer walk alone. He would live for himself. Walking alone through the city, the father felt a strangeness within. It was not fear, but a profound stillness, a feeling as if he had been born anew. His steps were no longer hurried as before, no longer burdened by the weariness and heaviness of past pains. Instead, he walked like someone who had found his own path, a path not led by others' expectations or unfulfilled desires. Everything around him was quiet, as if this world belonged to him alone. The streets and houses he had passed thousands of times were now familiar, yet strangely new. This was a world he had never truly stepped into, until now. And just then, as he brushed a hand over his coat pocket, a small object unexpectedly revealed itself. A lottery ticket his daughter had given him not long ago, just as a joke. At the time, he hadn't paid it much mind, merely smiling when she said, "Who knows, maybe one day you'll be as lucky as we are." He hadn't thought much about the ticket, assuming she was simply teasing him, an unimportant little gift. But now, with the ticket lying in his hand, everything suddenly felt different. He looked at the numbers on it, and they no longer seemed random. He stopped, eyes fixed on the sequence. A strange feeling washed over him. The lottery ticket was not just a worthless slip he had tucked away by accident. It was the key to a new door in his life. After a moment, he realized he was not merely someone standing outside his family's life, not merely the invisible burden his daughter wanted to push away. This ticket, though born of chance, felt like an unseen signpost from the universe, an acknowledgement of the power he had reclaimed. The ticket was not only wealth, it was a message. He was the second winner of the same jackpot his daughter had won. That was not merely a coincidence. It was a profound sign, a confirmation that he could still take charge of his life, that he could grasp his destiny without waiting for anyone's permission or acceptance. The father did not hurry to claim the prize. He knew that the $30 million would change his life. But he felt no rush of excitement, not because he didn't want it, but because it wasn't what he needed right now. He didn't need that money to prove his worth. What he had been through, the sacrifices already made, were no longer the engine driving him to seek recognition from others. The freedom he felt in that moment did not come from money. It came from the realization that he was no longer bound by anyone's judgment. He did not have to prove himself. He already was himself. This lottery ticket, once only a joke, had become a powerful symbol of the freedom and authority he had won back. He felt no need to rush to the claims office. He would not do that now, not because he didn't need it, but because he wanted to keep the ticket with him as a reminder of the road he had traveled and the person he had found again. It was not merely a random coincidence. It marked a turning point in his life. Each time he looked at the ticket, he saw not just numbers, but himself, a free person, no longer dependent on anyone, no longer seeking validation from family or society. He was himself, and that was the most precious thing he could have. This feeling was like a light flaring in his mind, a moment of poetic justice that made him feel he had reached a freedom he had long thought unimaginable. The years of living for others, of living by sacrifice, had become the past, and now he saw everything with new eyes. He no longer felt like an extra in the family, no longer an invisible ghost in his daughter's life. He was the master of his own life, and this lottery ticket was the clearest proof of that. When the father sat down on a park bench by the roadside, sunlight gently touched his face, and he felt a relief and peace he had not known in a long time. He looked at the ticket, clenched it in his palm, not letting it slip. This was the moment he understood that he had the right to control his life. Money, however vast, was only one part of what he could achieve. What mattered was that he had regained his dignity, stepped out of others' shadows, and emerged from the expectations he had lived under for so many years. With the ticket in hand, the father no longer felt lonely. He was no longer the one abandoned in the home he had once loved. The freedom he felt was something that could not be bought, a thing found only when you are no longer bound by the indifference and numbness of those around you. He left the park with his heart full of resolve. His life no longer depended on anyone's consent, and now he could write the rest of his story himself. As the father stepped out of the house he had spent his whole life building, everything seemed to pass by so quickly. That house, with all the memories and joys he had once shared with his daughter, was now only a small dot in the past. His footsteps on the familiar street were no longer hurried as before, no longer driven along by irritation or anger. Each step now carried a lighter weight. yet held a strength he had never thought he possessed. When he decided to leave, he was not someone giving up, but someone beginning his life anew, finding himself again. He was in no hurry, refusing to let himself sink into a sense of failure or anger. The years spent living within the family, working without rest to meet every need of his children, had taught him a deep lesson. Life is not only sacrifice and renunciation. He was no longer a person defined by others' needs. He had spent too much time, too much energy trying to change his family's life, forgetting that he deserved a life of his own, deserved the right to decide his own path. And at this very moment, when he chose to begin again, he did not seek revenge or resistance. He did not want to make his daughter or son-in-law regret what they had done. Instead, he only wanted to find peace in his soul, to find again the wholeness he had lost. With the lottery money, the father did not rush to spend it on luxuries. He made another decision, one that made him feel he was rebuilding his life from the ground up, from the simplest things. Instead of buying a big house or living lavishly, he decided to purchase a small, pretty house in another town. It was a place he had never known before, a new space for him to start over. The house had no opulence, no extravagant amenities, but it had the one thing he needed most: a spacious, sunlit garden. It was a space where he could find freedom and peace, a place without hurry, without the expectations he had to live up to. When he stepped into his new home, every space, every little corner brought a sense of change. Everything was simple, yet full of meaning. With the wide garden, the father found not only calm in the quiet, but also the strength to keep living, to keep giving to himself and to the community. The greenery and flowers he tended were not merely lifeless organisms. They were symbols of life, of hope, and of rebirth. Each morning, when he went out with a bucket of water to tend the flowers, he felt a small joy in every motion. Those plants, though only small varieties, carried a great message that life can begin again from simple things, from the small efforts we devote to it. His new life was not simply a matter of buying a new house. He began a small community project, a simple task yet full of meaning, helping restore a local park. The park had been abandoned for many years, and he decided to devote his time to reviving it. But he did not begin this work for fame or public recognition. He needed no praise or evaluation from anyone. What mattered was creating a public space where people could come and find peace. The park was not just a vacant plot with overgrown trees. It was a symbol of rebirth, of the new life he was reclaiming. Each day he worked in silence, speaking little, making no fuss, simply doing the tasks he felt were meaningful. Old benches were replaced, more trees were planted, and step by step, the park began to grow fresh again, just like the man himself. Each time he passed through the park, he had no need to seek recognition from anyone. The townspeople did not always notice the changes he was bringing about, but the father knew this was something he was doing for himself. It was not to receive thanks, but to feel the change within his own heart. When he saw families come to the park, children running and playing beneath the green canopy, he felt a deep peace. It was not acknowledgement from them, but the serenity he found in his work. No one needed to know who he was or what he had done, so long as the park became a place everyone could enjoy. With each step in his new life, the peace within him grew. He did not seek revenge, did not wish to make his daughter or son-in-law regret abandoning him. He knew the most important thing was peace in his own heart, not retaliation, not struggle. Each step he took in the park, in his garden, was a step toward release from the bonds of the past and from others' expectations. He had let go of what no longer held meaning and accepted what was new, what brought peace to himself. The father did not seek prominence, did not wish to become a role model or an object of attention. He only wanted to live a simple life, not for anyone else, but for himself. In the end, he realized that nothing is more precious than the freedom within one's own heart, and that such freedom can be found only when he stopped seeking validation from the outside. He had let go of the past, let go of the hurt, and now he lived simply to enjoy the days that remained, with serenity in his soul. When the news about the park aired, the daughter and her husband sat in the living room, unaware they were about to be swept into a quiet yet powerful wave. The TV showed an old clip, a short news segment, but for them, everything seemed to stop. The image on the screen was of a man they had once been very close to, the daughter's father, the man they had pushed out of their lives. The picture showed him standing in the newly restored park, wearing a gentle, serene smile. There was no sign of anger or hatred on his face, only peace and a kind of quiet strength, as if he had found release for himself in that work. The daughter and her husband stared at the screen, unable to believe what they were seeing. At first they thought it was a mistake, but as they looked more closely, they recognized him. The father they had once considered a burden. That man, with that peaceful smile, had quietly devoted himself to the community, reviving a small, abandoned park without seeking recognition from anyone. What he did was not for money, not for fame, but from a belief that he could make a difference, even a small one, in the community. And what he did not know, or perhaps did not need to know, was that his small acts created a great force neither the daughter nor her husband could have imagined. Seeing his image, the daughter felt a powerful shock. She did not know what to say, did not know what to do with the guilt rising in her. She had once thought his departure was simply an ending, a release for her and the family, but now she realized she was wrong. She had cast aside the person who had always been there, who had always cared for and worried over her, not because he wanted something, but because of unconditional love. She had not seen that, had not recognized his worth until it was too late. Now, watching him rebuild his life, working tirelessly to help the community, she realized that what was lost was not merely a financial opportunity, but an emotional bond she could never recover. She had let go of a vital part of her life too easily, and that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Her husband felt an indescribable disappointment as well. Looking at the father's picture, a surge of guilt rose in him. He remembered the times he avoided him, the times he scorned the father's sacrifices, the times he treated him as a burden. He had thought he was doing the right thing by asking him to leave, believing his departure would make family life easier. But now he realized the father had done something great and meaningful that he had never understood. Beyond helping the family, the father had contributed to the community, creating a green space for everyone. And more importantly, he had done it without seeking recognition. The husband felt ashamed as he looked at the father's peaceful face, realizing he had done all this for himself, not for others' judgment or expectations. He had misjudged the man, treated him as an obstacle in his life, yet it was he who had been wrong. This feeling was not new, but it was one they had never faced. Deep remorse. When the TV screen went dark, the air in the room grew heavy. Though no one spoke, both the daughter and her husband knew their lives had changed forever. They no longer saw the father as before, no longer saw him as a burden. Instead, they saw a man who had overcome everything: pain, ingratitude, abandonment. And what they realized, too late, was that in all they had been seeking, money, stability, satisfaction, they had overlooked the most important thing: the connection with a man who had always been there for them, who had done everything, not for others' praise, but out of sincere love and unconditional devotion. The news ended, but the silence in the room was heavy and inescapable. The daughter and her husband said nothing. They did not need to, because each of them understood what had just happened. The shame and regret were enough to say everything. They had not only lost a financial chance, they had lost the connection with a person they had once deemed meaningless. They had failed to see that the father's love and care were priceless. And now, with him no longer there, they had to face the truth that nothing could replace that loss. But the father, the one they had once considered weak, did not need their recognition to live a full life. He did not need them, and he had found the strength to live for himself. The lottery ticket, the restored park, and his new life were proof of the freedom and strength he had reclaimed. He was no longer a shadow in anyone's life. He no longer had to live for others' expectations. Each day, as he worked in his garden, and watched families enjoying the park he had helped revive, he knew that his life was his own, and no one could take that away. The sense of role reversal in this story is powerful and quiet. The father did not need to speak, did not need to prove anything. He only needed to live as himself, and the way he lived made the daughter and her husband realize what they had lost. Not just a financial opportunity, but the connection with someone they had so easily overlooked. Now, confronted with that loss, they had to live with regrets that could never be undone. The father was no longer in a hurry as before, no longer trying to finish tasks hastily or meet others' expectations. His steps along the road leading to his new little house were no longer heavy. Instead, each step seemed lighter, as if he were leaving behind all the worries, the pain, and the helplessness he had carried for so many years. The days of his old life were over, and now he stepped into an entirely new life, a life he could control, unbound by any expectations. Sitting on the porch swing, a cup of coffee in hand, looking out at the lush green garden before him, he could not help but feel a calm settle inside. This new house was unlike the places he had lived before, places where he existed only as someone dependent on others' care, where he lived under the family's endless demands. This house was a space where he could breathe freely, a place where he needed to do nothing but care for himself and what was around him. As he looked out at the garden, with its neatly planted flower beds and healthy trees, he felt his heart grow light, as if all the old burdens had been left behind. That swing, though simple, became a special place for him. Each time he sat there, he felt as if he slipped into a quiet space, no noise from the outside world, no rush of city life, only the serenity of a person who has found peace within his own heart. Every morning, when the sunlight fell across the garden and the first rays brightened the leaves, he sat there, savoring a warm cup of coffee and taking in the world around him. Everything slowed. Everything became gentler. But this peace did not come only from the new setting, from the house or the garden. It came from within him, from the realization that he no longer had to live for anyone else. Before, he had always lived for his children, for the family, constantly seeking their recognition and love. He had lived as someone who satisfied others' demands without ever taking time to ask what he himself wanted. But now he realized that this life is his, and he has the right to live it as he wishes, not for others, but for himself. Those earlier days, when he was merely part of a family in which he was not properly valued or respected, now seemed like a distant past. He was no longer the one upholding others' expectations. Each time he went into the garden and saw the grasses and plants budding and sprouting, he felt a wondrous connection with the world around him. This was not simple existence, it was living fully. He tended his garden not out of a sense of obligation, but out of the joy of helping it thrive. Each blade of grass, each flower brought a happiness he could find nowhere else. Each day, as he cared for the garden, he worked not only with soil and plants, but with himself. He no longer felt like a burden in anyone's life. In the past, living in the old household, he had always felt like an obstacle, someone who only received and could not give. But now he no longer felt that way. He did not need to prove his worth. Simply by living in peace, living for himself, he felt he did not need to wait for anyone's acknowledgement. Each day was an affirmation that he deserved this life, that he deserved what he had. Sitting on the swing with the cup of coffee in his hand, the father began to realize that this was his true home. Not a physical house, but the home within his heart, a heart he had never listened to enough, a heart he had never allowed himself to live honestly with. Having let go of what no longer brought meaning to his life, he began to listen to his own voice. He realized that nothing matters more than living true to oneself, living a life not for anyone, not for anyone's expectations. Only when we live for ourselves do we truly find peace. He sat there in the quiet of the house, not because he was fleeing anything, but because he had found freedom within his own soul. The new life was not an escape from the past, but an acceptance of himself, a love for himself. He no longer felt like a burden, neither to others nor to himself. He had learned to live for himself, and that was the most important thing. The sufferings and pains of before were now only faint memories, no longer part of his present life. Looking at the garden where he had carefully tended each plant, he felt a deep connection with his own life. Every plant, every flower was a part of his journey to find himself again. And as he sat there gazing into the distance, a sense of wholeness rose within him. It was not only peace, but the confidence and self-respect he had found. After so many years of searching, he no longer needed to live for anyone else, to please anyone, only to live true to himself, in respect and love for himself. In the end, he understood that the home he had found was not a physical place. It was a state of mind, self-acceptance and self-love, the belief that he deserves a peaceful, fulfilling life. And in that moment, feeling joy in each breath, in every heartbeat, he knew he had found his true home in his own heart. The final shot of the story, when the father sits alone in the quiet of his little house, is a delicate moment that carries deep power. The last rays of the day stream through the window frame and light his face, a face no longer marked by the anxious furrows or the strain of years spent living for others. In their place is serenity, a calm that only those who have endured pain and found themselves again can possess. As the light falls across his features, it is not only a beautiful picture of nature, but the image of a man who has found freedom within himself. He sits on the porch swing, a warm cup of coffee in hand, looking out at the garden, the place he has poured so much time and devotion into tending. The flowers, the plants, the rich patches of earth are not only things he has shaped with his hands, they are symbols of his inner transformation. In each leaf, each blossom that opens, he sees a rebirth, a new life he has created. Every morning, when he steps into the garden, smelling the damp soil and hearing the wind pass through the treetops, he feels not only the life around him, but life coursing within his own body, no longer bound, no longer subdued by anyone's expectations or constraints. The cup of coffee in his hand is not only a drink, it is a way he cares for himself, a way to pause and feel what he has been through, the steps he has taken to arrive here. In the past, he may have sat in other living rooms, looking out the window and wishing for a different life, but now, sitting on this swing, he no longer wishes for anything. He feels peace in every breath, in every heartbeat. He no longer feels like a surplus person in the family, no longer feels dependent on anyone's recognition or forgiveness. This life is not a life of seeking or waiting. It is a life of presence and contentment, with every lift of the cup to his lips, with every breath of fresh air. His awareness of the freedom he has reclaimed deepens. The freedom he found is not release from tasks or responsibilities, but release from the things he himself had imposed upon his life. Before, he lived in the misery of having to please others, of living under the demands and expectations of the family. Through those years, he always felt like an extra, an unacknowledged burden, and that made him forget himself. But now, sitting in the stillness of his home with the garden before him, he knows that nothing is more precious than the freedom to live true to oneself. No longer anxious about how to keep the family together, no longer feeling he must always be there to meet every need. He now understands that true freedom is not cutting himself off from everything that binds, but the ability to live as he wishes without anyone's permission. He needs neither his children's love nor their forgiveness, nor to answer to the invisible demands of a family that has changed. He has found freedom in no longer depending on anyone's judgment or recognition, and that is what makes him feel he is not surplus, but someone of real worth. The freedom the Father has found is not loud, no eruption, no victory won on any battlefield. It is a quiet triumph within him, a triumph of self-respect, a triumph of self-understanding. He no longer needs to fight, no longer needs to prove anything. He does not need to make others change their minds about him. Instead, he lives true to himself, and that has brought him a happiness and peace he never imagined. Not reunion, not the change of those around him, but change within himself. that is the most precious gift he has found. As he looks out the window and sees the garden change day by day, he understands that it is also the path of his own life. With each passing day, the garden grows more beautiful, greener, just like his own life. Each new leaf, each blooming flower is a sign of growth and maturity. Like him, step by step, he has passed through hardship and loss to arrive at himself. He no longer has to face the wreckage of the past, but instead new hopes, a life he can be proud of, a life he has built from his own effort. Freedom is not something distant, it is a feeling close at hand and easy to sense. The Father does not need to go far to find it, for he has it in his own heart. And in the end, when the story closes, he sits in his home, a cup of coffee in hand, looking out and feeling a gentle yet profound happiness. It is a quiet victory he need not declare or make public, only feel within. Without the family's love or forgiveness, he has found happiness in himself. And through this self-awareness, he leaves the viewer a powerful message. True freedom does not come from wealth or recognition, but from reclaiming one's dignity and self-worth. When we live true to ourselves, seeking neither others' forgiveness nor their acceptance, we are truly free. In the end, the story does not close with revenge or glorious triumphs, but with a powerful stillness, an inner release. The Father did not need to fight, did not need to prove he was right. From loss and abandonment, he drew a precious lesson. True freedom does not come from recognition or material things, but from recognizing one's own worth. Not retaliation, but a rebirth within his own heart. And that is the victory he won, the victory of self-awareness, the victory of self-respect, the victory of peace after so many years of pain. With slow but steady steps, he found peace in simple things, in a freedom he had never dared to dream of before. This story is not meant to judge or condemn, but to remind us that, however harsh life may be, we still have the right to rewrite our own story, to repaint the canvas of our lives with what we have, perseverance, forgiveness for ourselves, and faith in a brighter future. So, the question for you is this. Have you ever asked yourself whether we always need others' recognition to feel that we have value? Is it time to let go of those dependencies and begin to love and respect ourselves as we deserve? We would love to hear your thoughts on this story. Share your feelings in the comments below so we can talk together, heal together, and move forward on the journey of finding ourselves. For every story is a part of our journey. And with every step, there is always a chance to begin again.